Okay, so before we get started, just a real quick reminder, next Wednesday night, even though technically it'll be July, I think the 2nd, the new quarter doesn't begin until the first Sunday of July, which is the 6th. So we do have 1 week left of our study, and it's by the end of tonight, or willing, we will have one lesson left in our study. So it'll kind of match up very well, I think. Next quarter, we're going to be studying 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And so beginning next Wednesday night, we'll have notes for the introduction and lesson 1 or chapter 1 of 1 Thessalonians on the table next Wednesday night. And Lord willing, I'll remember to mention that as well. So just kind of be aware of that is the plan for our Wednesday night study going into next quarter is 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay, so lesson 12 is on the origin of man. It's discussing specifically the idea of the transition or supposed evolution of monkey and ape to mankind, and what evidences have been provided for that. Well, the bottom line is there isn't any evidence. There's all these talk about transitional fossils. As we discussed last week, however, most of those are simply subspecies. Okay, the majority of these fossils that they say are the missing link, they're just subspecies. That's all it is. And regardless of whether it's monkey to man or any other type of species, it's these transitional fossils. They're just variations. That's all. There is no transitional fossil showing one kind becoming an entirely new kind, and they're often based, and as we see Josh go through some of the evidence, supposed evidence, bone evidence, fossil evidence for the ape to man issue. We're going to notice how single tooth, for instance, sometimes is used to then extrapolate an entire new human being or pre-proto-human being that then eventually evolved into a human, when that's just a tooth. And certainly there's variations of all kinds of teeth, not only from humans, but apes and everything else. So a lot of their speculations based on fragmentary or single fossils, not whole skeletons. Not to say there aren't entire skeletons. We do have entire skeletons of things for dinosaurs and things like that, not to say that, but a lot of their extrapolation is based on something that you really can't extrapolate. And many atheistic evolutionists admit there is no true transitional evidence. That is not just a creationist claim. That is accurate to say that there are many, in fact, well-known atheistic evolutionists who acknowledge the issue that they have not found any true, that cannot be debated, absolute smoking gun, that this is a transitional fossil. And they haven't found it. And we talked a little bit about some of the quotes from Dr. Gee, both in 1999 as well as in 2001, and the fact that I thought was really interesting, he mentioned that there absolutely is no fossil evidence at all of chimpanzee evolution. So whereas chimpanzees and apes supposedly diverged along this hominid evolution, so you had humans coming out of one end and you had the chimpanzee and the apes coming out of another end, and yet there's absolutely no evidence of chimpanzee evolution. None. It's just chimpanzees. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the point that Josh made about the horse fossils. I mean, you have variations of horses like zebras and things like that, but they don't change. I mean, they're practically the same. And you can see over what's supposed to be millions of years, which it's not, but over millions and millions of years, they remain exactly the same. They don't change. So I think that's really interesting as well. Dr. Gee, and again, Dr. Gee's not a creationist. Nothing in this suggests, and I haven't looked up his background or anything, if he is now or what, but it sounds as though he's an atheistic evolutionist, but he acknowledged that this particular lineup that we have all seen in biology textbooks and things like that, it's garbage. It's based on nothing. No actual evidence at all. So we go to, and we talked a little bit about Dr. Landau and the kind of what was supposed to have happened, how that it went from living in trees to going to the ground, talking about proto-humans and apes and stuff, and then they start standing upright, then they develop intelligence and language, then they develop technology. And there's absolutely no evidence for that. That's just a concoction in their mind. And even Time Magazine reported no fossils found yet. Okay, that's the key component. No fossils have been found yet that prove this, but we think that this is what happened. So Then Josh goes into talking about the actual skeletal remains or fossil remains of some of these that have been purported to be the missing link or some proto-human that came along before Homo sapien. Okay, one was the Java man in 1887. Come to find, and again, this was based on I think it was 2 or 3 bone fragments. Come to find out, and again, these were hoaxes and fabrications. These are things that someone knew full well they were not. It's not like they were honestly mistaken. They were passed off as if they were real. And when in reality, the thigh bone was from a modern human, and the skull fragment was from a gibbon, which is a monkey. And whoever it was, they knew full well, but they tried to pass it off anyway because, I mean, I guess especially if you're not a scientist, you don't know what to look for. And especially maybe if individuals wanted to believe this, they're going to grab onto it and say, oh, the missing link, the missing link. And what a great find to prove creationism wrong. And yet this was a hoax. This was something that was not just accidentally not real, it was deliberately not real. The Pit Down Man in 1913, it took 40 years or so to prove that the skull was modern. Okay, but the teeth had actually been changed. It had been chemically treated to look as if it was human. And the teeth, they come to find out, was from an orangutan. And the perpetrator of this hoax wasn't actually identified until 1996. So what, 80 years or so from the time that this was perpetrated and said, hey, this Piltdown Man, and I've heard the Piltdown Man repeated many, many times since 1996 as being evidence of evolution from apes. And yet it has been proven not just to be an accidental mistake, but it was chemically altered. The teeth were chemically altered to make it look as if it were human. He brings up the Rhodesian man. This came along in 1921. This modern man fossils that somebody took and made them, kind of pass them off as if they were from what was supposed to have been proto-man. You have what's called the Nebraska man. And this was somebody took a pig tooth, just a single pig tooth, no other bones or anything else. And they made this entire reconstruction. In fact, in the book, there's a picture of the reconstruction of what the Nebraska man was supposed to look like, this kind of hominid, Neanderthal-looking guy. And it was all based on a pig's tooth, knowingly based on a pig's tooth. And then you have the Orca man, or the Ochre man, not sure how that's pronounced, but 1983, that skull fragment was from a donkey. It was just a skull fragment, and it was based on a donkey, or it was from a donkey. And there's other hoaxes and fabrications that Josh has addressed as well, going back to talking about the moth experiment back in was it the early 1900s or late 1800s, where they had the black moths and the light-colored moths, and again, that would have, even if it were real, it would have only proved survival of the fittest in the sense of because the trees had darkened, therefore the lighter colored moths just got eaten more. That's just survival of the fittest. If you're more in tune with your surroundings, you're going to survive easier than someone or something that isn't. And so that wouldn't have proved macroevolution. It's just variation of the species, and therefore it was advantage of a certain type of variation because of its surroundings. And even then they showed that they glued certain moths to the tree trunks and things like that. So then after talking about hoaxes and fabrications, he talks about fossils that originally they perhaps honestly thought were human or human adjacent, but proven actually to be fully ape. Okay, and when we talk about the hominid family tree, the hominid family tree is, at least according to scientists, you have the apes and the humans, okay, for all intents and purposes. And again, that goes back to what they claim. There was a single or singular type of ancestor from which the apes came and from which the humans came. So as far as a hominid is concerned, they consider apes and humans. And as we're going to notice here in just a minute, as Josh points out in Appendix G, he's going to mention that ultimately everything boils down to, is it an ape or is it a human? Because there is nothing that has been shown to be both or neither and yet still related. It's either an ape or it's a human. And that you can't make it something that it's not. But one of the things that is commonly referred to, it's a female fossil Lucy. It's 1974. This is something that gets brought up a lot. It was in Science, the Journal of Science, and yet it's been acknowledged by evolutionists as well as an article in Science Journal. This was an ape. This was not a proto-human. This was an ape, and in fact, as they, whether they knew it at the time but passed it off, but now more people have had a chance to review the evidence or whatever. But because of it has stiff wrists, and because they don't have bendable or flexible wrists, and of course, monkeys and apes they walk on all fours, and they have to kind of put their weight on their knuckles, and you can see that clearly with Lucy. This ape didn't walk up on 2 feet, and yet it had been claimed that she represented one of the first to do that, but she didn't. And there's several other points that he makes about Lucy in there regarding at least what we have of the fragments of the bones that shows just an ape. Nothing more, nothing less. Then there's another one. It wasn't named in terms of like Lucy, but the name of the genus is Ramatus or Ramatus. 1994, these bones have been acknowledged to be chimp-like, and even individuals who are well-known atheistic evolutionists have said there's no evidence yet to suggest that there's any link to humans with this. This is a chimp-like monkey. Again, variation of what you would say a gibbon or chimpanzee or all these other variations of monkeys that we have. We have all kinds of different types of monkeys, but they're all monkeys. And that's what this would be as well. And then you've got fossils that for a long time either were thought to be, or at least perpetrated to be, told or claimed to have been human or Homo sapien adjacent. Okay, in other words, these would have been pre-Homo sapien. So they would have been a lesser evolved form of human is the idea. Well, you've got Homo habilis, which anytime Homo habilis comes up, this is a pre-human. And yet they built circular stone-shaped huts, which animals don't do. They coexisted with the big ape, the Australopithecus. It was a big ape. And yet, supposedly, Homo habilis evolved from the big ape. So, yet it's been proven that they coexisted. So they didn't evolve from it. They lived at the same time that it lived. Which, again, they purport to be, long time ago, a million years ago, and so forth, which it wasn't. But the fact that they used tools, they built homes, those are things that animals don't do. Humans do those. Homo erectus, again, that should be an homo, not home or home. But Homo erectus, again, in that line leading up to Homo sapien, nothing suggests that Homo erectus is anything other than a human being. Some people claim the cranial capacity was too small to be human. And the measuring of the cranial capacity, though, fits perfectly within the modern human specs. And one of the examples that he brought up was the African Mbuti pygmies, whose cranial space is the same as a Neanderthal. And they're present-day human beings. And they're not any stupider or dumber or anything like that, less intelligent. They're human beings, just like you and me. They're just kind of a variation of what we are. There's nothing different there. And so everything that they point to or say Homo erectus was, less evolved and so forth, and yet it fits perfectly on the human spec, what you would call the human spec scale, I guess. There's nothing within its anatomy that suggests it was anything other than a modern man. Then you have Neanderthal. Neanderthal is perhaps the most commonly mentioned, and not mentioned in the text is also Denisovan. In theory, what they have is 3 main families of human being. You've got Neanderthal, you've got what they're now calling Denisovan, and then you've got Homo sapien. And I think that's really interesting. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. But the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and the human beings all coexisted at the same time. All 3 of these families of human, and yet, supposedly, the Denisovans and the Neanderthals were pre-human in the sense of they were less evolved. But we're going to come back to that in just a minute. Josh brings up some interesting points about the effects on humans who have severe vitamin D deficiency. There's obvious physical variation in the bones of what's called Neanderthals. And it's not just one Neanderthal bone. There's plenty of Neanderthal bones that have been found. But if you start looking at what the effects of vitamin D deficiency is, you see a lot of what you find in Neanderthals. The type of leg shape that Neanderthals have, there's something about being bow-legged. And of course, that can also happen from what else? Any cowboys? Okay, if you spend your life on a horse, you end up bow-legged. Okay, so that can happen that way too. But vitamin D deficiency, especially if they stayed in caves a lot. Okay, if you don't get a lot of sun, in fact, today it's been estimated something like 20% of Americans have some spectrum of vitamin D deficiency because we stay inside a lot, especially in places that's hot. So vitamin D is very, very important for us to be able to function properly. So that could just be modern human that on a kind of epidemic type scale, they're vitamin D deficient. But they engaged in everything that we do. Everything that we have ritualistic burials, we have the building of homes, we have the building of instruments to make music, tools. In fact, some of the tools even have handles and things to accommodate the fingers and so forth. So it's like a lot of thought was placed into this. It wasn't just some kind of cave-like man that you think of and see in movies and stuff picking up a stick and banging it around. Okay, these were people who thought about things. It wasn't like they were just kind of absent-minded type of, really kind of stupid humans. That's not what these individuals were. And then in some modern cases, these skeletons of what would be Neanderthals would seem to be a Neanderthal. There are modern individuals in places in the world that if they were to die and their bones were just left, and somebody came along in 20 years and found them, they would think, oh, I found a Neanderthal skeleton. And come to find out, no, they lived 20 years ago. They died 20 years ago. Because the way in which the Neanderthal bones, especially the brow ridge, it's really interesting how you see that today in certain areas of the world. In fact, Elizabeth's dad has this trick he does where his brow ridge is so pronounced he can take a domino and sit it on the top of his forehead. Okay, and it'll sit there. He's a Neanderthal. Apparently it's pronounced Neanderthal, but it's TH. It's Neanderthal to me, but apparently the scientific way to say it is Neanderthal. That sounds Neanderthalic to say that, but Neanderthal. But anyway, so there are human beings that would look like, from a skeletal perspective, Neanderthals if you didn't know any better. Okay, so it's not like they're some weird variation. No, they still exist today. In fact, going to Appendix G, and I wanted to work in Appendix G into this because he goes into a little bit more detail specifically about the Neanderthals. In fact, some of the appendixes, anyway, they are kind of like one-off bulletin articles that he wrote for his congregation's maybe a newsletter or whatever that they, bulletin or whatever that they do. Maybe these were articles that he published in some kind of journal or something like that. But he had one specifically talking about the Neanderthal. And he mentions how that all hominids end up either being human or ape. There is no in between. And you can see it in the skeletal structure itself. In fact, there's I highly recommend it. So you can talk to Keith as well about this, but there is an excellent documentary. In fact, me and some of the kids watched it as well. Some of my kids watched it, called Is Genesis History? It's on Amazon Prime. I know that much. I don't know if it exists elsewhere on other streaming platforms. There's also a sequel to that about how the mountains were made. And it goes in and talks about the flood and how the flood can explain all of that. But they actually have a paleontologist and a biologist type individual who has two skulls. One of them is an ape. Supposedly these are related individuals, okay, in terms of the evolutionary tree, but one is very clearly an ape. It has a snout that comes out, and the other is just a earlier human in the sense of earlier in terms of not an evolution, just with extended brow ridge and that sort of thing, just a variation of human. And so it's not like you can clearly see that one fits on the ape side, the other fits on the human side. And every bone that has been confirmed to be a hominid, okay, remember the pig tooth that they thought was Nebraska man, but every confirmed hominid fits in one of the two categories. There is none that fit into some third interspecies or intermingling of those two. And that's very important. There was a huge study, a DNA study done in the journal Science, that showed that human and Neanderthals were genetically so similar that they're more closely related, Neanderthals are more closely related to some modern humans than they were to one another. Now, and that may be entirely because they coexisted and they interbred with humans. Okay, and I keep saying humans as if they weren't humans. No, they were all humans, but Homo sapien, I guess you could say, and Neanderthals. Can you interbreed a dog and a cat? Okay, what about a lion and a horse? Why not? They're different kinds. Okay, they're different kinds. And when God told everything to be fruitful and multiply, it was within those kinds. And we've noted before how that there's genetic scientists who've said it seems as though DNA is built in such a way that there are limits to how much variation and how far you can go. And those limits kind of end at crossing species. You can't crossbreed species like that. Subspecies, yes, if they're related and they're closely related enough, sure. Okay, that's how you get all kinds of different variations of dogs, but not cross species. Now, if Neanderthals are that closely related, then why not just call them human? Okay, maybe they looked a little bit different. Okay, maybe they had certain features that were very, specific to them, but that didn't make them any less human. Anatomical measurements is a very important clue as well. And this goes back to the Denisovans also, and I wanted to bring that up because all of these that fall into the human category, they are all anatomically within the same range that we have today. Okay, we have individuals with dwarfism. Okay, we have individuals not maybe as much as there used to be back in Genesis, but we have individuals with giantism. Okay, so that DNA exists within us to be able to produce those who are very small and those who are very large. And then you have kind of the median or the average in between all of those from that whole spectrum of all humans that currently exist. The Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and even going back to Homo habilis, and all of them all fit within the same range. There is nothing that is abstract or outside or an outlier to suggest that this is some sort of proto-pre-human who wasn't really intelligent and he was basically a monkey in a human-like body. Doesn't exist. Even though they wish it would and they're looking for it, they're trying to find it, it doesn't exist. All right, the other thing he brought up is some of the stuff that happens within Neanderthal society. That they, again, this is based upon all of the bodies that they found, based upon tools and things that they've been buried with. They actually, not only did they have ritualistic burials, but they had cemeteries that were maintained for decades. Okay, whether they were a single family. And what do we read in Genesis? How that Abraham, he buried Sarah in a certain place. Remember, there was a cave that he purchased. I forget who it was from. It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, he purchased this place to bury Sarah, and then most of his family ended up being buried in the same place. Okay, and that happened a lot. You kind of had this family-type burial place, whether it was in the ground or in a cave. A lot of times it was a place specifically for you and your ancestors. This is where you were buried. And we even see that on a societal scale as well. There's a famous place in Egypt associated with the pharaohs. Does anybody know what that place is called? Huh? I'm sorry. The Valley of the Kings is what I was thinking of. Yeah, the Valley of the Kings. And of course, you have the different, burial places of all these individuals too. But within those Valley of the Kings, you have all of their families, as they died, would be buried in there as well. And so this is not something that's unique to human beings or to Homo sapiens, or to whatever you want to say. Neanderthals did it too. Nothing different. There were 4 sites. And he mentions this in the article, something like 256 different cemeteries that were discovered. And at 4 of those 256, human and Neanderthal are buried together. And then that place is maintained. It's as if the Neanderthal and the human considered each other the same. We're both human. Okay, humans are the only ones that bury themselves with themselves. It's not like, hey, we'll add this in, we'll add that in. We bury each other with each other. And if Neanderthals were these kind of less evolved, kind of stupid, grunting, cavemen type people, Do you think we're really going to be associating that much with them? You wouldn't think so. But that's all they were. Neanderthals ground. I don't know what the past tense of to grind is. It grinded or ground? I assume it's ground. But they ground grain for food. They would set broken bones. There's evidence they performed surgery. They used fire for cooking and for tool working. And there's a whole list there that Josh includes of evidence that they have found that shows how sophisticated their society was. And likely these weren't pre-flood humans. Because based on where they're finding these skeletons, they're being found post-flood in the strata and so forth. That was after the flood. And so these would have been individuals who probably descended from Noah. Now, there's a key component there. We don't have, the scriptures don't tell us that Noah and his wife had any more children. Okay? It doesn't say that they did. Maybe they had daughters and they weren't mentioned because the genealogy is focused on the males. So maybe they had more daughters or something, but that might be all. But for sure, what we do have evidence is Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Now, Moses tells us that those three families ended up going their separate ways and being forced to go their separate ways after the Tower of Babel. Okay, in fact, in Genesis chapter 10, we find kind of the genealogies of Shem, Ham, and Japheth and kind of how they spread out what they ended up settling. But why they ended up settling that, he had to go back in Genesis 11 and explain it. This is the Tower of Babel. Well, how did they end up with different languages? Genesis 11, God forced these different languages. He says, nope, you're advancing too fast. We're going to separate the peoples. My personal belief is he separated them and moved them to the different continents at that point. But whether they were driven out because of the language barrier or God literally moved them to the different places isn't really relevant. The bottom line is you had three main families that dispersed into all the earth. And we have Homo sapien, Neanderthal, Denisovan. And to me, that's very interesting that it's those three that keep coming up in what's supposedly the human family record. And to me, that may suggest, because you got to figure, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but you got to figure every type of ethnicity, every type of skin color came from those three families. Okay, from those three. It means that all the DNA was there. And that says a lot about how God made that work, how he arranged all of that. One of the points that he made, which I thought was a really interesting point too, is the fact that some of these individuals, after the flood, we see a gradual decrease of lifespan. Okay, Noah lived something like 900 years. But then gradually after the flood, you see a scaling down of that lifespan to the point that you then, once you get to around Abraham, he lived, around 175 years, kind of in that range or so of how they were surviving. Now, could God have snapped his fingers and made that happen? Absolutely. There's also, the suggestion that, the climate changed, big time after the flood. And so there's a lot of things that could have impacted that. Sure, that could be too. But regardless, the point that Josh makes is regarding Neanderthal bones, that is what you would expect to see in people who live for multiple hundreds of years. These thick bones that you find the Neanderthals had, that's what you would expect to find in human beings who might live for 500 or 600 years. So that's very interesting that could actually represent basically what humans look like after the flood. As these ages are gradually kind of scaling down, the bones don't have time to kind of build up that thickness over hundreds of years anymore. And so then you kind of get to a point where those aren't as thick as they are today, or aren't as thin as they are today. So I thought that was a really interesting thought on that. All right, thoughts on that? Okay, so as he ends chapter 12, Josh goes back to what does the Bible say? Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, God created Adam and Eve. God created male and female. Jesus mentions that. He quotes that when he's talking to, on multiple occasions, Matthew chapter 9, as well Mark chapter 10 is one example, Matthew chapter 19, no, not Matthew chapter 19, Matthew chapter 9, and then Matthew chapter 22 as well, regarding the resurrection and so forth and given in marriage. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, Paul specifically mentions that Adam being the first man, and then of course Jesus brought in the opportunity for the resurrection from the dead. Genesis chapter 7 and 8, then God started over with Noah, his 3 sons. And again, whether Noah and his wife had more children or not, we don't have that specific information. Okay, Noah was pretty aged at that point anyway, but for sure, Shem, Ham, and Japheth had lots and lots of children. And so the world started over with those 3 couples. All DNA for every variation. You got skeletal, that includes dwarfs and giants. In fact, we know there were giants in the land of Canaan because the 10 of the 12 spies came back and said, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. Okay, and they're related to what the name of the giant, apparently, who was kind of the father of the giants, was named Arak, or Arak, A-R-A-K, I believe is how it's spelled. But anyway, there were giants prior to the flood, and there were giants after the flood. The only link between those two is not that the giants survived, it's Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That DNA still existed. Blood type, we have all kinds of different blood types. Okay, some of the blood types interact and work well together, some don't. Eye color, skin color, all of that exists. And all of that was contained within the design that God created in man to start with. And it was all there. Now again, could God just as easily have snapped his fingers and made people different with different eye colors, hair color, stature? Sure. But the design and the beauty of the DNA also provides that evidence of a creator that he did this. At the last page, Josh has this chart, which I think is pretty cool. He talks about Neanderthals. If there's some people who believe in God and believe in creation, but they think that maybe Adam was allegorical and it just kind of represents man's evolution, or for that matter, that maybe Adam was kind of the beginning. God kind of started the evolution of man with Adam, and then man kind of came along as the monkeys got better and better. But the chart that he has here actually shows us some of what Josh refers to as the intellectual capacities of the first humans of the Bible, to show that it's not what they claim Neanderthals would be. So, for instance, you have the ability to subdue and have dominion over the earth. God gave man that ability. That was before even Adam and Eve sinned. Okay, this is before the knowledge of good and evil. So they had that capability even before they ate of the tree. The ability to comprehend and process questions from God. Okay, and to have that discussion with God. They were able to do that. The ability to tend and keep a garden of flowering plants and animals. That was part of what God entrusted Adam and Eve to be able to take care of the garden and the animals. And Adam named all of the creatures, remember? And there was none found as a helpmeet for him. That's why Eve ended up being formed. He named Eve as well. And then, of course, after they sinned, they were able to be ashamed. And I think there's kind of this idea that, well, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents kind of this metaphorical coming of intelligence or self-awareness, consciousness. And that's not it at all. Adam was fully aware and conscious prior to eating of the tree, and so was Eve. In fact, Eve's conversation with Satan proves how mentally, intellectually capable she was. You see that even before they ate of the tree. All the tree did was enable them, again, through the process of whatever existed, enabled them to have the ability to know right and wrong. That's it. It basically told them what God's law was. That's all it did. And then all of a sudden, what the mental capabilities they already had caused them to be ashamed when it was linked with what God said about being naked. So, and I think I thought there was one more thing that I wanted to mention here, but I think that's it. Yeah. All right. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention was the fact that it says that he named another human Eve. Not only was he able to name another human Eve, but he knew where she came from. She came from me. And that's why he called her Eve, or we called her woman and then named her Eve. He called her woman because she came from me. She was created from me, from my rib. All right, so going to the questions very quickly. Matching our questions here. Rickets. D, vitamin D deficiency. Nebraska man, number 2. B, case of a pig making a monkey out of a man. Number 3. E. Number 4. C. Number 5. F. Number 6. A. Yep, that is the process, at least the supposed process by which scientists think that man became kind of what we are today. And then true or false? Number 1, monkey to man belief is not widely held among evolutionists. False. It is very widely held. It's argued over what the mechanism is, but it's widely held. Number 2, the study of the evolution of man is a philosophy rather than a science. Yeah. In fact, you would even say it's more so philosophy than a science because there really is no evidence for the evolution of man. Number 3, Piltdown Man was a hoax created from filed down and chemically treated bones. True. Yep. From tooth, specifically orangutan tooth. Number 4, Lucy had flexible wrists like a human. False. Number 5, some Christians deny that Adam was actually the first man created and said they teach he was the result of evolution. True. Yep. I would go with true on this one. If you wanted to say false, simply because what Josh specifically talks about is how that Adam may have been the result of evolution, not necessarily, or how that he could have been the beginning of evolution. God, kind of started evolution with Adam and then let it kind of go forward, like maybe he was the first ape. But there are variations of that belief. So yes, I would go with true on that. All right. Quick, short answer. Name some habits of Neanderthal man that suggest he was human. I'm just going to mention tools, jewelry, music, burials of the dead, maintaining cemeteries. That wasn't in the lesson. You'd have to go to Appendix G to read that. But then there were other things as well that he listed in the chapter as well as Appendix G. But he was human. Number 2, which 3 prophets declared that Adam was the first man? Namely, which 3 did Josh mention? Moses, Paul, and Jesus. Yeah. And by prophets, they were referring to people who had the Spirit of God, who knew the facts. Okay? He's not saying that Jesus was just a prophet. He's just referring to individuals who were speaking God's word from the Spirit. Number 3, what evidence do we have that the first people created in Genesis 1-4 were highly intelligent human beings? They were able to subdue and have dominion. That chart that we just saw, the conversation that they were able to have not only before they sinned, certainly with Satan that Eve had, and presumably perhaps with God even before they sinned, because God walking in the wilderness sounds like something, or in the garden sounds like something he did regularly. I mean, they were innocent, they were pure, they dwelled with God. So you have all of that you can see they were mentally capable of fully understanding things. They just didn't have God's law of right and wrong yet. Okay, they were like children in that sense. They didn't know that there were things called right and wrong other than what? The tree. And you see that from Eve in her conversation with Satan. That was the one thing she knew was wrong.
Language and reasoning skills.
Oh, language and reasoning skills. Yeah, what was supposed to be a process, they already had it. God created them with it. Number 4, name the 3 categories in which supposed ape-man fossils may be placed. Sorry? Bogus bones. Okay, these are hoaxes. These are deliberately fabricated. Apes. And then modern man. Number 5, who was the author that made famous the monkey to man hypothesis? Charles Darwin. What evidence did he provide? None. No evidence at all. Fabrication. All right, that's it. We will pick up and, Lord willing, finish our book with Lesson 13. Lesson 13 deals basically with the idea of how this macroevolution is infiltrated our society and what it then produces within our society. Thank you, everybody.